this on? Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm going to do this with a bottle of water, and I was hoping to have a huge carafe of coffee, but that didn't work out. I'm also the only American here. The goal of this, I'll be talking basically to sort of set the stage for the 2 days. Part of that will look at the globalization of the market. I'm told I'm the only American here, so that's maybe indicative of where things are going as well. But thank you, Georgina, for the really kind introduction, and thanks to everybody here, Conrado, Paula, Emilio, Mr. Carlos, and everybody in Barcelona for organizing this. I was here 2 years ago when we started this, and at that time I was working with the VIP Art Fair, which was the online art fair, talking about the internet. So I'll touch on a little of that today, but more importantly, I just want to set the stage for everybody else that's speaking, so that we can get things underway. So we'll begin by looking a little bit at some familiar developments, really the growth of the market over the last 10 to 20 years, and then shifting to this giant event-driven turn, which is really much talked about nowadays and has completely shifted really the paradigm. I think the slides we were looking at earlier are indicative of that from the 80s. There seems to be a growing tension in the marketplace nowadays too. There's been a number of articles really just in the last few weeks criticizing and seeming to really drive something to the core of what's happening in the marketplace nowadays. And I'll wrap up by trying to summarize a few key shifts that seem to be happening and to open on to what that might mean for the gallery business specifically, but perhaps some other broader developments as well. So Claire McAndrews is coming, I think she's speaking later today, is really the market data guru. So I'm taking 2 slides from her annual studies that she does for TAFE. This is the first that really just shows the growth of the market over the last decade, specifically looking at auction sales, or rather this is auction private sales. And basically what you can see is that the market has essentially doubled in size in the last decade globally. We see it hit a peak in the 2007-2008 period, then decline, but rebound quite significantly. Contemporary art, as everybody's quite aware in this room, has been the real driver of that. Definitions of contemporary art are multifarious. In this case, this data is pulled from Art Price, and it's defined as art made by artists born after 1945, which is different, and Claire will probably touch on this in her talk later, but it's a bit different than her own definition. In any case, what we can see is really in the late 90s, there was an incredibly small market for contemporary art at auction, only $44 million sold by that definition in 1998. That peaks at a total of 1.35 billion in 2008. So the ascent of that, at least in the auction standpoint, has been tremendous. In the public realm, we've of course seen a cascading of record-breaking prices. The Scream that sold at Sotheby's a year and a half ago now at 120 million. This was the famous Picasso that Steve Wynn put his elbow through. He was originally selling it to Steve Cohen for, I think, $135 million. Put his elbow through it, got some notoriety, patched it up, and sold it for $155 million. In the private market as well, we've seen other sales. This is, at least where we stand nowadays, purported to be the largest single art transaction ever. Cezanne's card players for $250 million selling to the Qatari royal family. At auction, the Bacon triptych, which sold at Sotheby's in May 2008, at the peak of the market, still holds the record for the most expensive work of art sold in the post-war contemporary auction. But this week in New York, there are 2 pieces that there's some speculation may break that. This Bacon triptych of Lucian Freud, and then this Warhol car crash, both with estimates at around 60 to 80 million US. And if the market's heady enough, people think that they may both eclipse Bacon's earlier record for the most expensive work in post-war and contemporary sale, and potentially even eclipse the 120 million for the Scream. Outside of the auctions, of course, there's been a huge notoriety around what the sort of the star branded artists are up to. Damien Hirst, of course, opened his exhibition in Doha last month at auction, or not at auction, rather, in the gallery landscape. Certainly in New York, there's a huge controversy very publicly over Gagosian and Zwerner battling it out for Jeff Koons. This is an install shot from the Zwerner show of Koons this past spring with this new series of work with these gazing balls. For those of you that were in Frieze a few weeks ago, this is the man himself and his dealer posing triumphantly in their booth at Frieze, which not uncomplicatedly was directly across the aisle from Zwerner, and I suspect was a quite specific jibe at Zwerner. I was walking around New York the other day and noticed this Lady Gaga. She's just released her new album, straddling a gazing ball. Koons did the cover art for this. So it's yet another illustration. I think the album's coming out this week, but it's another illustration of really the sort of pop status of some of these major artists and their interpenetration into sort of broader consumer culture. About a year ago in Paris, the big story was, of course, sort of Gagosian and Ropac battling out for these two giant exhibitions or new galleries on the periphery of town. This is Gagosian's space in Le Bourget and Ropac rather in Pantin, just on the other side of town. In London, White Cube opened their new exhibition space in Bermondsey, which is like a spaceship. Zwerner opened their space on the other side of town in Mayfair in a townhouse. Of course, Zwerner is not the only of the American dealers that come to London recently. Pace has opened, several others as well. Back in New York, meanwhile, Zwerner opened their giant space, this Annabelle Soldorf space on 20th Street. Hauser, the Swiss/London gallery, opened just a block away or 2 blocks away on 18th Street. And earlier this fall, Peritan opened his space on the Upper East Side with this huge exhibition extravaganza, which has sort of been the party to date of the calendar in New York. Elsewhere in New York, the New Museum is launching their new museum at the end of the High Line in Chelsea, shifting from the Upper East Side, where they've been for many years. The museum's set to open in 2015, so not quite yet. In another week or two, Eugenio Lopez in Mexico City, of course, is opening his private museum. It's not a gallery, of course, but certainly indicative of the huge number of these private initiatives that I'll touch on in a few moments as well. And lest one forget that every gallery in the world is now also jockeying to have a footprint in Hong Kong and Asia more broadly. This is Peritan's inaugural show a year and a half ago during Art Basel Hong Kong, or just before it became Art Basel Hong Kong. White Cube, Simon Lee, Lehman Maupin, many others have opened in Hong Kong, and as I understand it, Ropac himself is rumored to be opening somewhere in Asia, but not in Hong Kong. So with that being said, we're not just seeing a rise of values around these major blue chip branded artists, so to speak, but a whole shifting of where business is being done in the art world. The US and the UK, certainly from a commercial standpoint, remain very much the center of the trade, but the market dynamic is shifting tremendously. This is data from Claire looking at the growth of the market from 2006 to 2011. And what we see on the right side, or on the left side rather for you guys, in 2006 is essentially what had been in place for a long while, which is the US and the UK essentially comprising somewhere in the range of 2/3 to 3/4 of the auction market by value. What happens not even 5 years later is significant scaling back of business being done in the US and the UK, and China rising from really a marginal player. If you were to probably take a slide from 2001, China was probably somewhere in the range of 2 to 3%, and it goes to 5% in 2006 and up to 30% in 2011. When Claire published this data, significant also, and you'll note that China had eclipsed the US to become the largest singular domestic art market in the world. So that's quite a feat in 5 short years. Last year in 2012, the markets rebalanced a little bit. The market in China cooled, the U.S. Accelerated, and that's essentially where we are now. Now, that being said, there's a huge amount of controversy and discussion over the legitimacy of all of this data. It's no fault of Claire's, of course, but there's been a huge discussion around the legitimacy of the data itself, fake bidding practice, market for forgeries as well, all taking some of that attention. This was the cover of the New York Times 2 weeks ago, I think, Wednesday, the 28th of October. And it's significant for a few reasons. One, that a story about the art market actually made the cover of the Times is, to my knowledge, and Georgina might know better than I, extremely rare. The data that's presented in it is absolutely astounding. And the journalists that put it together, essentially cut off at the knees the legitimacy of all this data about the Chinese market. So discussing issues such as fake bidding at auction, essentially to drive up prices, the fact that a lot of the business is not consummated on the back end, so that you bid something up at auction, and then essentially the auction houses and the largest mainland auction houses are still government run, are essentially not changing hands. And there's discussion of museums in the mainland where 3/4 to 90% of what's on view are purported to be forgeries. So that's essentially where we are. That being said, I think it's safe to assume that irregardless of those types of practices, the market in China specifically, but in developing markets more broadly, is certainly bound to impact how business is done moving forward. Probably the singular most key shift in the business over the last 2 odd decades or so has been this dramatic event-driven turn in the business. We can see the roots of that really from the growth of the auction business itself, which really had occupied essentially a wholesale trade to something that had become retail-focused and shifted out of the professional hands of a small few insiders and dealers. Beginning in the early 70s, there's the famous Skull Sale in New York. We have the rise of modern contemporary auctions. That all, again, began to take shape in the early 70s, and as we looked at that data a few moments ago, accelerates dramatically in the post-2000 context. The 90s, after the fall of the wall, were really known as the biennial decade. It was a decade in which essentially every aspiring city in different developing parts of the world secured both a mixture of government and public subsidy and private subsidy to fund temporary exhibitions. And that shift is well known, from Sao Paulo to Guangzhou, et cetera, et cetera. What's shifted dramatically since then is that the art fairs have come and essentially stolen the thunder. Art Cologne was founded in 67, Basel itself in 1970, but really since the mid to late 90s, we've seen this huge boom in the fair business, to the extent to which today there's reported to be something in the range of about 200 international art fairs. The exact number, of course, is a bit unclear. In any case, what we know is that fairs are commanding more and more and more of the attention of the collectors, and have essentially become one of the most primary conduits for galleries to conduct their business. Claire, in her study this past year, estimates that fairs now comprise 36% of gallery sales, which is up from 31% the year before. And certainly in my shoes, anecdotally, there's plenty of dealers that I talk to that sell anywhere from half to 2/3 or 3/4 of their business at fairs. There's all different kinds of fairs as well. There's heavyweight fairs, the Basels, the Frieses. There are regional fairs that service specific markets. Contemporary Istanbul a few weeks ago, Art Abu Dhabi later this month. There are niche fairs, so Perry Photo next week. And then there are satellites as well. All of this is pretty well known at this stage. And the rationales for participating are multifold. For some dealers, again, it's sales. Certainly for everybody, it's essentially establishing a network, meeting people. And then there are softer benefits as well, promotion, simply being seen at a fair, being seen next to a gallery that you aspire to or consider to be a peer. So there's a variety of reasons. In terms of how the fair business itself has shifted, I think there's two key paradigms, I think, that have come into play. One is that the fairs themselves, somewhat like the auctions, have shifted essentially from professionalized trade fairs to museum or sort of experiential extravaganzas. I think Art Basel's introduction of Unlimited in the late 90s is a good example of that, where you have this shift outside of the sort of cube gallery booth into really into the terrain that had formerly been allocated to museums and indeed to biennials itself during that time. The second is the lifestyle trend. Again, I think Basel's move into Miami in 2002, delayed until 2002 from 9/11 2001, is certainly the most obvious example. But we see it as well in the recent founding of Frieze in New York with this giant tent, the spectacle of food and the surroundings, and even with Perry Photo's expansion to LA last year, or this past spring, where the fair itself opened in this backlot of a studio. And so the whole experience of simply being there was in many cases on par with whatever one saw itself. So this is, of course, a conventional fair landscape. And this is this sort of shifting of that. This was actually, it's a famous photograph. It was taken in '94 at the Gramercy International, which was the predecessor to the Armory show. So it was Jay Jopling and Tracy Eamon smoking a cigarette in bed in the Gramercy. And the Gramercy, speaking to alternative presentation formats, was really the first hotel fair of its kind, which is something that has accelerated as well and is fairly commonplace nowadays. This, of course, is Unlimited. A huge hall with huge oversized sculptures and installations. A Rondinone piece from a few years ago. And of course, these things have spilled outside of the fairs as well. This is in Friese's Sculpture Park in Regent's Park with this House of Ghosts sculpture. And at the Armory last year, we launched an outdoor initiative. This is this giant word piece by Carrie Leibowitz. So it's something that more and more fairs are doing. One interesting addendum to all of this, and I know Artissima just closed, is that it's not just large-scale things or things outside, but in Artissima's case, the fact that somebody like Francesco Manacorda, who's essentially a curator, would become the director of this contemporary art fair is interesting just as a development, where we have, again, this shift away from fairs being purely market-driven to something that's more than that, more substantial than that. Every fair nowadays, of course, has a talks program. This is Bjork with Ragnar Kjartansson at the Armory 2 years ago. And this is, for those of you that haven't seen the pictures, this, of course, is Frieze coming to New York in the largest contiguous tent in North America with great light, great food, great giant sculptures by Paul McCarthy. This is Perry Photo in LA in the backlot. This is the New York backlot. So literally you're at a fair, which in a way is attracting you to see this part of LA that most people have never seen before. Beyond the fairs, the whole market has really been characterized recently by this blurring of boundaries. And Georgina nodded to this before, but we're seeing auctions encroaching on the dealer terrain. Haunch and Christie's a few years ago, which didn't work out so well. S2, which is Sotheby's gallery showroom, has been much discussed as well. And of course, beyond that, certainly in the wake of the 08-09 crisis, you have the auction houses shifting more and more of their business to the private treaty sales realm, where they're really competing more directly for secondhand work with dealers and no longer in the public showrooms of old. Dealers themselves have undergone a huge change. The obvious tipping point of this is the gallery expansions that we referred to, the White Cubes, the Zwarners, the Hausers, with these knockout show spaces. And of course, and what Gagosian himself has really been driving, but there are many others that have followed this as well, are these historical and in many cases non-selling shows. The Ad Reinhardt show, which opened at Zwarner last week, is a great example, and a phenomenal show as well. But beyond that, we've seen galleries opening project spaces. There are other galleries, and I think some folks here will be talking about, the sort of blurred terrain between a commercial gallery and galleries that also have achieved a not-for-profit status. They, kind of straddle both worlds. And then, of course, there's the globalization. But the interesting thing for me about where we are with this globalization curve is that it's not just the Hausers and the Zwarners and the Gagosians that are dictating these trends, but we have smaller and mid-level galleries that are now opening multiple operations as well. Klaus is somebody that's in Klaus Nordenach in Berlin. Stockholm, of course. Galleria Continua is operating in San Gimignano, essentially in a non-contemporary art market center. Then Le Moulin, which is about an hour south of Paris, and then in Beijing. So this gallery that's having an incredibly ambitious exhibition program, but not in a market center. Sver Semler, Gregor Podnar in Ljubljana in Berlin, and then somebody like Clearing, who's in Bushwick in the depths of Brooklyn, and then also on Avenue Louise in the center of Brussels. Is a very young gallery. It's indicative, basically. The other trend, of course, that we've seen is not just the Zwarners and the Hausers showing older artists or artist estates, but a younger generation of artists that's not just showing emerging work, but looking back at some historically relevant work. Jessica Silverman's a young dealer in San Francisco who's opening her new space with Amakan Turen, who's an Israeli UK-based artist who's actually never shown in America, and he's in his 60s. So again, those trends are interesting. On the collector side of things, we have this huge wave of private museums having opened really since the mid to late 90s. The Sachis, the Rubels, et cetera, et cetera. A few weeks ago in China, the Sifang Museum in Nanjing was sort of where everybody in China was. It's this private museum, real estate complex development, which has gained a lot of attention. Outside of the private museums itself, we have collectors setting the pace through their own gallery project spaces. Adam Lindemann with Venus over Manhattan is an interesting example in New York. He's not representing artists, but he's doing shows at a level that many of the other galleries are. And of course, we have private museums and collectors doing pop-up exhibitions wherever the art world happens to be stopping by. The Prada Foundation's reinstallation of When Attitudes Become Form in Venice this past summer is one example of that. And Vito Schnabel seems to be somewhere every 6 to 12 months doing something that's super cool with all of his friends. On the artist side, we have artists becoming entrepreneurs, and this is nothing new, of course. And most of the discussion around this is centered on the Hearsts, the Kunzes, the Murakamis, et cetera. But we have new rules being made in areas like China, where artists themselves are setting the tempo. They're not necessarily as loyal to galleries as they are in the West. Many of them are selling directly from their studios and creating new networks of meeting. Somebody like Ryan Trecarton is interesting, certainly from an internet or video perspective, principally because while his galleries sell and place his work as museum-relevant material, he maintains an internet site where everything he creates is also posted for free online. And recently, Marina Abramovich has used sort of fundraising, crowdsourcing to fund this new institute of hers. So again, it's indicative of what's happening from the top down. And then within the fair landscape itself, as I just mentioned a moment ago, we have fairs becoming more and more and more like museums. Unlimited, independent New York. Frieze Masters is a great recent example as well, of course. Artissimo, which I mentioned, but specifically this Back to the Future section that they oversee. And at the Armory, we do a focus section each year. We have a curator come in and curate with us. So all of these are indicative of how that's shifting. So recently, I've noted, I wouldn't say a shift, but I think there's a sort of brewing tension under the surface of all of this, both on behalf of dealers, and I think something that would be addressed this week, but specifically on behalf of journalists or whatever journalists are left that people are listening to, that basically are saying, this is really, too over the top, that, we've lost all sense of meaning. And that, contemporary art has essentially become nothing more than a playpen for the ultra-rich. In this month's art forum, Julian Stalabras, who's actually my PhD supervisor at the Courtauld, launched a scathing attack basically on all of this, where he's criticizing the speculative culture that fairs have set in play, and also the fact that fairs, essentially, he's basically blaming fairs for global warming. So the whole, he's highly critical of people shifting or shipping stuff around and basically being on too many planes. And he has a point, but there seems to be, it's very heavy-handed. Beyond that, of course, we have disenfranchisement with other things, with market manipulation, forgeries, some of these opaque structures. Again, this article in the New York Times is a good example of that. And there was a response to that article by Blake Gopnik, which I'd encourage all of you to read. It was in the op-ed section of the Times last Sunday, where he actually takes the argument one step further and says, we've come to a state actually where we should basically just embrace forgeries as the only real critique of the art market nowadays. And it's a pretty heavy-handed account, obviously not all totally serious, I don't think, but he raises some interesting points within it, as well as some, outright silly ones. For him, politically, he feels that forgeries are great for the market, essentially because it would return the market to a place that museums could once again purchase things. And I think there's certain problems with that line of thought, but in any case. This data is pulled from Claire McAndrew. There's been a lot of discussion about the middle market flagging and basically all power shifting to the upper echelons of the blue chip power dealers. And this data is particularly telling. This is from Claire's study of the dealer landscape last year. And according to her survey, for dealers who have turnover less than €500,000, business was down year on year by 17%. For dealers that do between 500,000 and 2 million, it declined 1%. 2 to 10 million, down 2%. And for dealers that are doing business above 10 million euros, they had actually seen an increase in 55%. So this whole sort of Occupy Wall Street mentality is really shifted and totally exploded in the contemporary art market. And I think data like this certainly drives the point home. What we're seeing beyond that cold data are a number of different factors. First of all, the cost of doing business is only getting higher. Real estate prices, rent is increasing. The cost and pressures of participating in all these international art fairs and events is growing. There's questions around whether the market itself is becoming saturated. There are certainly in cities like New York and London and Paris feelings that gallery visits are on the decline, that people just don't have time anymore, and they're only going to the blockbusters, the auctions, and the fairs. As Georgina mentioned, there is this issue of artists getting poached by the bigger dealers. And Pierre Bourdieu is somebody, for when I was doing my PhD, that was very influential. And his basic theory of how the art market works is essentially that you have a long-term investment in symbolic capital, so you're investing in ideas and context and relevant critical structures that over time can be generated or churned into economic or financial gain. And if we extend that to the concept of the way that galleries work, it's essentially the fact that a gallery represents a pool of artists, and hopefully all, if not at least a few of them, will at some stage become famous, valuable, and a dealer essentially can recoup his costs as their prices rise. But with this trend toward poaching and the hugely competitive pressures that the industry is currently experiencing, that theorem is essentially becoming ruptured. and dealers that make these long-term investments are essentially under attack by other structures that essentially don't allow them to capitalize on those investments. So I think that's something, certainly for the context of the next 2 days of discussion, that'd be interesting to hear the perspective from a number of you. One of the other things that is certainly been bandied about recently is fare fatigue, that people are just flat out exhausted, that there's simply too much stress on the system. Again, costs are rising. There's essentially too much pressure to participate. And more than the galleries themselves being exhausted, the artists simply don't have the work. Artists are getting asked to make work for one fair and then the next fair and then a gallery show, museum show, et cetera, so that the pressure is simply too great. And the question that we're in the midst of today is, what's the tipping point within this, and how is this going to change? One of the other critiques, of course, of this system is that with the rise of these fairs and the sheer number of them, as well as the sheer number of galleries participating, there might not be enough good art to go around. The fall fairs in both London and Paris, that was something that came up in a number of articles and some of the chitter chatter as well. Not to mention the auctions in New York last week, where they were a bit flatter than people had thought. And again, this issue of whether the material was quality enough was raised. So to come full circle with all of this, there's a few observations that hopefully are somewhat relevant and can steer some of the debate for the next 2 days. First and foremost, it seems to me that galleries will inevitably have to scale back. The day of galleries doing 8 to 10 to 12 plus art fairs seems to be shifting. I think a few years ago there was a phase in which galleries simply cast a wide net and tried a lot of things, and I don't honestly see that happening anymore as we move forward. The costs, again, are escalating, and I think in some way galleries, may even, or at least there's an opportunity for galleries to shift some of those costs that are very expensive for them, and to open up new pathways for other entrepreneurs in the marketplace. Simply take one example, production costs are not necessarily a gallery's core business, or producing work on such a scale for artists is not something that's core to galleries. And I think that some businesses may start up that can help galleries offset some of those costs and shift some of that risk. Again, I think galleries will be more and more strategic and specific in what fairs they do, and will seek more clear benefits from participation when they do participate. In terms of other trends that I think we'll see, I call this sort of intelligent innovation. I think we'll see galleries continue to build and expand their networks internationally, and also with dealers locally through joint representation, joint fair participation. Obviously, this has been something that's been going on for some time. It's not unique, but I think savvier dealers will do a better and better job of building those networks even stronger. And as we shift back to the gallery business itself, I think there'll be more and more focus on realigning primary or sort of forward-facing business and what goes on behind closed doors. I had an interesting conversation with Sean Kelly just the other day, who we work closely with at the Armory, and he threw this statistic out and basically said when he opened his gallery in New York in the early 90s, there was a mentality that your gallery is essentially 30-30-30. So you had 30% dedicated to your exhibition space, 30% to storage and office, and 30% to your private viewing rooms. And according to him, this huge new gallery that he just opened is actually only 20 to 25% exhibition space, about 20 to 25% office space, and 50% viewing space. And I think that that's something that's kind of indicative of a very strategic recalibration of somebody's business that's also looking to ensure a balance of where he does his business. He's very conscious about not wanting to do more than about a third of his business at art fairs. So I think we'll see more and more dealers coming up with more sophisticated strategies for that. This is just a few slides of the space itself for those of you who haven't seen it. This is this amazing library, and then again, these are the sort of private sales rooms that he has set up. I think Zwarner's new space, both on 20th Street and in Mayfair in London, is indicative, as are essentially all the galleries that have opened in Hong Kong, which are more or less private showroom spaces with a public element. In terms of other areas for innovation, the internet, which I've not really touched on, but I think others will in greater depth, I remain bullish on, but in very specific ways. I think the internet will be an incredibly valuable tool for sales in the gallery realm, at least for the foreseeable future, under about $10,000 to $20,000. The key drivers of the internet for the galleries, I think, will remain as a more sophisticated ad tool in a way. And we'll see a shift of advertising dollars away from the art forums, et cetera, towards more sophisticated strategies online that can potentially result in sales, but just as equally be more strategic lead generators for business done both at fairs and in the galleries themselves. This was an article in the Wall Street Journal just over the weekend on Paddle 8, Artsy, and ArtSpace, who are three of the key online businesses nowadays. In terms of looking at what's going to be happening in the fair landscape, one question that's always raised is, aren't there just too many fairs? And in a way that I don't really have an answer to that, to be honest. It's not that obvious what the right number of fairs is or how many too many actually is, in a way that's sort of an economic analysis that would need to be undertaken by somebody that really look at market data and analyze it. What I do sense is that certainly at the high level, for the Basels, the Frieses, the Fiacs, the Armories, et cetera, I think that we will see less and less galleries participating in those fairs at some level, or galleries at least being more strategic in which ones they do. I think that many of these fairs that can't demonstrate a real return for their clients in terms of sales and positioning will be under a lot of pressure, and some will definitely fall by the wayside. I think we'll certainly see more of the global franchising that we've undertaken in the last couple years, with Basel both opening in Miami and opening in Hong Kong. Frieze with their recent launch of Masters in New York. Perry Photo LA, there's been rumors as well of Fiac potentially doing something in Asia too. So I think we'll see more of this, and it certainly makes sense. It's good for collectors and collector networks, et cetera, and it creates a feeling of being part of a club. That being said, I think there are certain risks as well. One is certainly the homogenizing that occurs as that process unfolds. It's not necessarily that easy to do. Certainly one thing for us at the Armory that we've looked at is within this increasingly frenetic fair landscape, how do we stand out as a fair that really feels very distinctively New York? So I think that's something else that all of these fairs will need to undertake. What makes them specific? What makes them sort of tie into the local community? That sounds very basic, but in some way it's maybe more complicated than one thinks. For us at the Armory, it's really about being the gateway to New York, to America to some extent. We work very closely with the other fairs that are on simultaneously, develop networks and partnerships with MoMA and other key cultural partners. And then next March, the fact that the Whitney Biennial essentially shifted its dates to coincide with us creates this really nice moment in New York of that really being the art week in New York's cultural calendar. Just go through this kind of quickly, but I think being in Midtown, this was a project we undertook with our architects a few years ago, which plays to this a little bit. We hired architects to kind of make the fair a lot nicer, and then didn't realize that we forgot to allocate a budget to furnishing these nice new spaces. They came up with this fun idea of actually salvaging all these chairs, bringing them to a taxi cab painting facility, and then siting them throughout the fair. So again, it was this nice thinking by people that we work closely with about how to make the fair feel very New York. Again, working closely with the local government. I think something that's going on here is kind of interesting. This is Bloomberg opening last year's fair, and again, the Whitney. Beyond this then, to conclude, I think there's a few things that we'll be seeing as we look forward. One is I think that the blurring of these boundaries within the marketplace is inevitable. It's driven by increasingly steep competition, scarcity of high quality work, and the need to constantly look for new markets and new ideas and innovative strategies, also to stand out from the crowd. I think it's also part and parcel of the art world globalizing. It's very easy from a Western perspective to say things in some of these developing markets feel different or possibly even shady. But I think that those types of practices will come to play a more and more vocal part of how business is done internationally. To take one example from China, I was there recently at the end of September, and it's kind of interesting that in the Western markets, there's this huge reluctance to sell to anybody that's known to be speculative from the outset. All this discussion around art investment funds and collector speculators is a good example. In China, at some level, some of these art investment funds that have been started really are it's the only viable source to sell work. So the whole mentality of the gallery system there is much less politically motivated than it is in the West vis-a-vis those types of avenues. That's kind of interesting. I'm not saying it's good or it's bad. I'm just saying it's interesting to observe that from the outside. I think, again, that sales through the internet and other types of channels will increase. I think we'll see art popping up in spaces that we wouldn't otherwise have expected it to. K11, which is essentially this art shopping mall initiative undertaken in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and there's 16 or 18 others developing, is an interesting example of that, where you have art being brought to a public through a shopping mall, and serious art too. Lastly, I think we'll continue to see a lot of different types of speculative dalliances with contemporary art. Restoration Hardware just last Friday opened their new space in New York City. Restoration Hardware is it's a multi-billion-dollar furniture company that's undertaken this contemporary art initiative. It's not entirely clear what that will mean or what they'll end up doing, but it's not a foundation. It's not a collection like K11 is. And it is very specifically sales-oriented. And I think from their perspective, they have incredibly ambitious goals of really changing and impacting what the gallery business is. Now, despite all of this, and almost specifically as a result of developments like what Restoration Hardware is undertaking, I think it's clear that the core fundamentals of what the gallery business stands for and represents very much still matters. For all of you that haven't read this article, you should do so. Dorsey Waxter, who runs Greenberg Van Doren in New York, published this op-ed piece in Art Info 10 days ago. And it's really a call to slow down and essentially return to some of the fundamental values of the gallery business, to encourage people to go back to their dealers, to support their local dealers, to stop traveling as much. It's interesting as well that in her capacity at the ADAA, she's essentially representing an institution that one of the core activations is an art fair. But in her mind, we need to return to more pure fundamental initiative within the gallery business, and to continue to reinvest in those businesses. I think one thing that inherently she teases out is the fact that the very fundamentals or notions of what a gallery is have come under sort of reconsideration. And I would encourage everybody in this room to really, each time you hear the word gallery bandied about, to think carefully about what that means. A lot of gallery initiatives like Sotheby's initiative isn't really a gallery in the same way that I think we're talking about galleries today. Sotheby's is not representing artists. It's basically a short-term speculative sales operation. And we're seeing a lot of that in developing markets and elsewhere, where you have this whole sort of profusion of project spaces and gallery spaces, where you have a curator that's basically trying to put a program together and really just sort of seeing what works. And I think as more and more and more of those initiatives unfold, I think it becomes more and more valuable for gallerists that represent a stable of artists that stand for long-term relationships and a certain set of professional practices and ambitions rise in importance. Now, one thing that I'd say, and this is really my final comments, are that we can't be nostalgic of this shift back, that as the gallery business slows down and as we try to return and embrace more fundamentals, there are still a few things that have shifted. One of which is the whole paradigm in which art is seen, validated, and sold. I think it used to be that you had a gallery show and a museum show and then maybe a bigger museum show, and now we're seeing really a growing equivalence, I'd say, across a variety of different avenues, whether that's a gallery show or a presentation at an art fair or any number of shorter-term exhibitions, et cetera. So I think that there's been a shifting within that. And of course, the marketplace itself is totally decentralized. We can look at that critically, as the sort of global gallery franchises essentially creating a more homogeneous market structure. But I think there's real opportunities there as well. And one fundamental thing the changing face of the business has achieved is the fact that you can be nowadays an ambitious gallerist working really at a remove from these core market centers in New York, London, or Paris. And I think that that's both interesting and fundamentally incredibly important to the future shape of what all of our business will look like. So moving forward, I think as all of those things are shifting and as all of these questions are being raised, it seems clear to me that establishing a best practices around how all of these processes unfold is more and more imperative, and hopefully today, tomorrow, and in the time to come, these issues will be teased out more and more clearly. So I think for now that's what I've got. But thank you. I think we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions if people have any.
I would like to hear your comments on the VIP art fair. In retrospect, now a couple of years later, you were engaged in it, and I understand that it wasn't a big success, but I'm sure that there was a lot of things to learn from that, and I would like to hear it from the horse's mouth.
So for those of you that don't know what VIP Art Fair is, it's a business that was set up by James Cohan, who's a gallerist in New York, and partner with a guy called Jonas Almgren, who's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And I was hired essentially to sort of direct it and to set it all up. And what we were trying to do was to create a structure in which we could take an art fair online. Several of you in this room, Kamel and others, were part of that. We gathered about 150 galleries, and over the course of a week, set out to display and sell art online. When the fair opened, there were a number of technological problems. Essentially, we hadn't anticipated the giant scale of demand for the product that we created, and the site crashed, and there was a lot of negativity around what happened. So clearly, at one level, it certainly didn't go as we had hoped it would. That being said, there were a number of interesting things that came as a result of it. One off the bat was that despite some of those obvious problems, some people did sell. And some high-value sales occurred. There were sales in the six-figure range, which was kind of interesting to see because, honestly, we had no idea what to expect. But that was one thing that came out of it concretely. But I think more interesting than the out-and-out sales was what happened in the aftermath. There was sort of this dark period. The fair was the end of January, and we were obviously in conversation with a lot of the dealers and trying to keep pretty low profile. And when we went to the Armory show about 6 weeks later, several dealers pulled us aside and said actually they had sold things at the Armory to clients that they had met through VIP. So there was this realization that actually, even though it clearly didn't go as we had hoped it would, there was this realization that actually it had succeeded at some level in putting work in front of a relevant audience who had processed it, learned about things, and started approaching dealers in the flesh. And that cycle repeated itself, where even through Basel, 6 months later, there were people that were selling work to people that they had met online. So I think the one thing that I took away from that was that, sort of what I was saying before, that I think the internet is particularly suited in the high-end contemporary art market to do just that. I think every dealer will make their own decisions vis-a-vis what they choose or not choose to put online for sale. But I do think that certainly from the sort of lead-generating, marketing, advertising vantage, that the internet is incredibly amenable to that. And I think we'll see more and more of those types of initiatives, whether exactly mirroring what we did with the IP Art Fair or more, 24/7 platforms as we move forward. So for me, it was really interesting, and certainly what we're doing at the Armory show is to try to, we work with Artsy now to essentially put the fair online. A lot of fairs are doing this, but we've developed a really nice dialogue with the team at Artsy to try to each year at the fair innovate and do a few new things that hadn't been in place before. And I think for us, think of what I'm doing now at the Armory, is that we really want to be ahead of that curve and to embrace that as much as possible. Because essentially any opportunity that we can give to the community of dealers that we work with to make sales and get in front of people is from my vantage, what we should be trying to do.
No, it's very, very interesting, and we can feel the shifting value in terms of the galleries. But what I miss is that it's a very important point, is that how people today consume art. And we are today in a world where people consume art in a very, very different way. And art is not at all defined as it used to be even 5 years ago. First, art for me has become a cultural good. It's no more art as the symbolic value of art have moved a lot. And the best example is now you have art on eBay, which is kind of demystification of art. And you have to take into account the fact that the people, how they consume, how they look at art is totally different today. The other thing which is very important when we speak of the internet, and a very good example is given by Christie's. The internet has brought to Christie 25% more people interested in art. It's not just about the sale, it's about the fact that with the internet, you can increase, and in a very determined way, you can increase also the number of people getting interest in art. So I think that what is important today is not just how the galleries have to shift, but they have to shift also on how the people are also today looking at art.
Yeah, I mean, I totally, that's a correct statement.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I think we don't insist enough on this part of, what shall I say, the ecosystem of art, of the people, the shifting audience of art and the shifting way of collecting art.
Yeah, but also it's a question of how people spend time with art as well. I mean, art today is basically clicked on cameras, consumed, discussed, and then sort of processed or not processed. And I think some of what Dorsey Wachter was talking about is just really trying to slow all that down again. And how we achieve that is more or less up to debate. But, there are ways to do that, and one of them is to maybe see a little bit less, but see things in a more deep way.
Hello. First, thank you for your presentation. I like it very much. And I have two short questions. One is if you could define now a profile of galleries and dealer in the actual moment. And the second question is the art production about the artists, because I think in this explanation artists were not very present. The production is changing. There are cities that are more concentrating the interest in production in art. This is the two questions: the profile of the galleries and the
What do you mean about the profile of galleries?
what do you think it must be a gallerist at this moment? Is about the knowledge, the languages, he must to be an university studies of art. What else?
So, like, what is the background of somebody that's a gallerist?
Yeah. What do you think is the now?
I mean, I think one of the great things about the art world is that there's not a molded profile that you fit into. I think, being passionate and committed to what you're doing is the most important thing. And I think, it's very easy to forget or overlook the fact that art has no value, fundamentally. It's all about the context and the environment that's created around it that creates meaning. And it's a lot about the relationships that we have with those people that create those environments. I went to Restoration Hardware on Friday night. It looked like art, but something felt weird. And it's basically commoditized. And it's a good example of how context is created when you see something in relation, just mentally and psychologically, you process that this is somebody that's thought long and hard, and that this is here because that's there, and this is what that person's trying to do. And the great thing about art is that there's not, you can be an artist and become a gallerist. You can be a business person, become a gallerist. You could be a gallerist and become a gallerist. Everybody has a different profile. But I think that what connects many of the people in this room and what makes certain people really accelerated is that they're, fundamental dedication to what they're doing, and the fact they're consistently looking for new things. And also, more and more, by the way, and this is what I alluded to a little bit, but probably in a kind of jet-lagged fashion, but looking back and back again. And I think one of the clearest things that we've seen recently is this contextualizing of contemporary practice through relevant historical practices, both famous artists like Gagosian or as Warner rather, showing Ad Reinhardt, who's, of that generation of artists in mid-century New York, like super political, super politicized. It's great that they have his black paintings complemented by these, all these comics that he was famous for drawing. But then this younger generation of artists that, are constantly rediscovering people that fell off the radar and repositioning them in a contemporary dialogue. So I think, what we're seeing more and more of today is this ability to find these nuggets and to place them in a dialogue with a younger generation of artists that's, really, really effective. I'm not sure I addressed your second question, but hopefully somewhat.
The second question is about if you had found that the art production is concentrated in some cities or not.
I mean, the obvious answer is yes. Like in the U.S., like I'd go to L.A. nowadays just because there's a lot going on there. People have space. There's great art schools. The context is interesting again. So the obvious answer is yes, but I think the other side of that is, you can still be an interesting artist because of the internet, because of this event-driven turn in today's market, and be able to still have touch points with an international audience in a way that you couldn't have even dreamed of 10 or 20 years ago.
Thanks, Noah. Where are we now? You excluded in your charts the rise of the galleries. Over the last 25 years, obviously there was a huge rise of galleries around the globe, and you did not mention that in here.
Just the sheer number of galleries?
Yeah, you just went on the auctions. You went on the market. But the galleries itself, and also the artists. I mean, there's a zillion artists today. They all
I probably just took that for granted. But yes, there has been an insane rise in just the sheer number of galleries, and also sort of like gallery, but not really gallery practices that are now out there. And I think, one needs to question how much of that is whole and good in a way. Clearly, a lot of these galleries are up to good things, showing good artists, but at some level, one can only process so much in a way. And I think that there's, if some galleries are closing, it's maybe not the worst thing necessarily.
I see. Just one question. Why do you think gallery matters today?
Well, I think for the same reason that I was just talking about with this gentleman. I mean, I think that, gallerists are valuable precisely because they are the kind of crux of the system in a way, and carry all that risk to invest in somebody that they see wherever, in art school, somewhere else from far away, and to create meaning and context around that. And I think galleries matter precisely because if you don't have that in the middle of that system, I don't know where that's coming from. And galleries that do their jobs correctly, essentially are doing it for the long term and are putting their capital, their resources, but their full reputation behind something. And I think, we live in an age in which things are more and more temporary, more and more speculative. And I think that a good gallerist is still somebody that can create these structures in a meaningful way, and impart that in an important way that museums, collectors, the press, other people pick up on. That's what they do fundamentally. Yep.
Qatar. How do you think it inflicts on the art market today?
She said how the Arab buyers impact the art market. Yeah. I mean, well, Sheikh Al-Mayasa is now the most powerful person in the art world, right? So isn't that what was just voted by Art Review? Clearly, like in any historical cycle, there are key kind of, whether it was the Rockefellers and the Mellons at the turn of the century America, Pinot, et cetera, and nowadays all the focus is on these mega-rich Brazilians, Chinese guys, and then the royal families in the Middle East. I mean, clearly they are underpinning a certain amount of demand in the marketplace. Museums are being created and filled because they are generating demand. And for certain markets and for certain actors within the international market, obviously it's having a strong impact. That being said, there are a lot of parts of the market that doesn't. Well, I think that's a lot of it, and I think inevitably all of these chains usually start from the top and then filter down. So I think, yes, I mean, the obvious answer to your question is that it's benefiting the same guys who are selling, whose sales went up 55% year on year, that are selling 10 or more million euros of work. It's clearly benefiting them most, but I think, if it's done in an intelligent way, it will filter down throughout that economy.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I think it seemed to be a lot about how to market art, which is great. And I just wanted to make, I suppose, two comment type questions. The first with regard to the internet. Whilst it's a new technology and it's great, I think some research has shown that it's a great way to actually get people to know about the art that's out, but people will actually come to a gallery and see it before they'll actually purchase. So in that sense, the gallery remains very important. It may be a tool through which you can find out about new art, but actual sales, I think, in the end, a lot of these, sites that are out trying to sell art through the internet have found that. I don't know if you have a comment on that. And secondly, there seems to be a trend of trying to market art in a particular way which is perhaps a little bit underhand. I mean, you mentioned this sort of exhibitions which were non-selling museum-type exhibitions. They were not non-selling. They were marketing tools, really, to sell. Don't you think?
100%. I
think it's important to say that, really, because they're not really non-selling. It gives out a wrong message of what it is. It was a tool, and a very clever tool, to actually make very big sales at the end. And I think more and more people, the people who are buyers, are beginning to see certain trends like that, and I suppose you can do things like that only for a while.
Well, or not a while, but I think I had it in quotation marks, right? So it's, it's a trend that's been set in place, which basically is indicative of the fact, and again, this gets to this sort of shifting of how gallery business is done from, using an exhibition as a venue or a tool to generate a sale to basically using that as a tool to build a brand or a franchise. And non-selling exhibitions fall into that perfectly. I mean, you might not necessarily be generating money in the short term on those sales or on those shows, but you most likely are going to have inventory by those or related artists that you are selling. And certainly you're using that, Rob Storr, for example, curated the whole show at Warner right now. You can rest assured that every client of that gallery that's getting anything about Ad Reinhardt is getting told that Rob Storr curated that show. So you're building value around your brand, so to speak. So I totally agree with what you're saying. And again, it's a shift that we're seeing certainly at the highest level, but also sprinkling down through the system. And I totally agree with what you're saying. With respect to the internet, again, galleries as structures and positionalities within the art market, in my opinion, are not going anywhere anytime soon. The internet is just another conduit or another tentacle for somebody to learn about a gallery and potentially make a sale. And I think to counterbalance what you're saying, I think we will see more and more art sold sight unseen through those avenues. At the same time, when we started VIP Art Fair, part of the premise behind starting it was because Jim Cohan and many of his colleagues in the business, he knew firsthand that a lot of what he does is sold through email and JPEGs. Many of his clients are already familiar with an artist's body of work, and you've got a waiting list or something, and you're picking up the phone. You have a relationship with somebody. They trust you because of what you represent and what you've done with them previously, and the internet can facilitate that in a way. So I think that it's on the one hand never going to replace or never going to supplant the gallery business, but it's not going to do that specifically because of the core values that the gallerist ordinarily put into the market.
Hello. 2 or 3 years ago in France, I read some very interesting articles, but pretty worrying ones as well, concerning a player on the art market that you did not really mention. Well, you did not mention. It's the artist pension trust. So I was just wondering if you didn't, because it's something. So for artist pension trust is a very restrained system, a kind of care system, a social care system for artists who are supposed to give 2 works a year to the system, and then when this artist pension trust sells one piece, all the artists take a certain percentage of the piece. Well, it's a bit complex, but it was organized with some very important people on a symbolic stage. So I was just wondering whether it was kind of something that has no impact anymore, or if it's just hidden and,
Well, the Artist Pension Trust is really interesting as a business, right? It was started by a guy called Moti Schneiberg, who's basically an entrepreneur, and he partnered with these other Israeli economists. So there was like real academic fundamentalism behind it. And what they're trying to create, for those of you that don't know what it is they've basically set up in different regional market centers, so in Berlin or New York or Barcelona possibly, and they gather pools of artists, and each of the artists contributes work over a certain period of years, and the idea is to really create a long-term financial planning solution for artists where they stand to benefit through sales that happen in the future. That being said, there's a lot of inherent problems with how it's set up. One of the more fundamental of which is, how you get an artist to ever allocate work to that fund that's at the highest level. You would basically assume that an artist would be more incentivized to give the best work to his dealer to sell it for near-term gain and might just allocate other types of, lesser significant things to the fund or the trust. I mean, there are a lot of issues around it. At the end of the day, the Artist Pension Trust really is a sophisticated art investment fund for the investors themselves. It doesn't call itself an art investment fund, but the tool that it serves, which is to basically make money over the long term by aggregating huge amounts of art in this pooled manner, serves that purpose. But, I think it could also be argued, and we'll see if it works out for the artists that participate, that, it's not a fundamental wrong for the artists themselves. It's just a new way of thinking. And, as all of these art fund or art investment initiatives come into play, I mean, they do raise fundamental questions, of course, of the value of the gallery or the dealer within that system, and how that relates to the artist. Because fundamentally, a good dealer that's working with an artist over the course of many years should essentially provide that blanket or that long-term support to that artist as well. So this is diversifying it somewhat, and the verdict is very much still out as to whether it'll work or not. I didn't mention it today. Somehow it seems to have fallen off the radar a little bit. I think they started that about 10 years ago. I know it's still out there and they're still setting these things up. There are many curators that I'll meet from time to time that are involved with them in some way. But it seems somehow a little bit less relevant nowadays than it did when they started. I think there's time for one or maybe two more questions. Or one more. Yeah.
I've got a microphone already. Hi. I was just curious to ask you whether you think, what impact you think the proliferation of art, prizes, art awards have had on the ecology of the art world, and particularly the impact on the galleries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I suppose it's a fundamentally good thing. You're basically, creating a more direct path for capital to flow into the art world and to support artists. A lot of the prizes, of course, are more, essentially repackaged intelligent sponsorship opportunities, in a new way. I mean, I think one thing, and I can certainly speak to my own work with the Armory, shows that more and more corporate partners you talk to, there used to be an era in which, a corporation would essentially just sort of cut a check, put its logo on things, and not ask any more questions. And now we're seeing, increasingly active participation in all aspects of the business, from how corporations are involved with museums to how they're involved with art fairs and so on and so forth. And getting behind an art prize is one, very direct and quite meaningful sort of example of that. And, I think that it can be a really good thing in many ways for a lot of the people involved, as long as one understands, the broader structure, that it occupies, and as long as you're comfortable as a recipient or as an institution working with that party with what, with what that relationship entails. What do you think?
I think, like you say, it depends on particular sponsor or brand behind it. But I think in terms of uncovering, it's what you were talking about, is there enough good art out there? I mean, what some of these prizes do, if they're working in specific areas, is actually help to uncover artists working in, geographically, but also, in many other ways, different, mediums or different kind of genres, if you like. And it does help to kind of open up and give some of those artists opportunities that are maybe working particularly geographically in parts of the world that just don't have other platforms for that kind of exposure. But yeah. I think, like you say, it depends on, you have to take the criteria and understand what it is you're working with.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that generally, and but the prizes, I think are quite good. I mean, not perfect at determining generally quite good artists. And more of them are vetted by curatorial committees of real actors that people like and trust. I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them. So, it's basically indicative to me of where we are in this cycle. And I think broadly speaking is, certainly linked to more intelligent thinking on behalf of the corporate side of things about how to get involved in a meaningful way in the art world, rather than this old kind of linear model that used to exist.